Hello everyone, and welcome to session 2 of the Metadata Roadshow. I'm delighted to say that John Horoditsky is with us today. Thank you, John, and over to you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Metadata Roadshow. Today is all about taxonomy design. We are joined by Aldis with Phil Siebel, and also joining Phil will be Autumn from Best Buy. So before we get started, just wanted to have a few sort of housekeeping slides just to organize ourselves for today, no pun intended. My name is John Horoditsky. I'm a Managing Director of Insights and Analytics for Salt Flats. I'll be the moderator for the entire Metadata Roadshow series. I've been doing digital asset management, metadata taxonomy for the last 20 years. Very privileged to have worked with clients in the Fortune 1050 and up, CPG, media and entertainment, pharma, insurance, so much more. I also teach a graduate course in digital asset management at San Jose State University. Do a lot of public speaking around the world, been a part of the Henry Stewart events series for many, many years, and wrote a book a few years ago on DAM and have a new book coming out on metadata in November of this year. All right, so this is the Metadata Roadshow. There are 6 sessions for this series. As you can see from the screen in front of you, this is the session 2 on taxonomy design with Aldis. We then have ones next week on workflow, then collaboration, UX, UI, and then artificial intelligence coming forward. Why are we doing these episodes? Why are they happening at this point in time? Because metadata is everything, and without it, you have nothing. We want to make sure that people in the industry, we've been hearing that metadata is something that is important to them. We want to make sure that everyone's aware of how much that metadata can unlock the power of the content that you have. And what we have seen in the last many years doing digital asset management work and listening to people, we know that DAM is really nothing without metadata. So whether we're designing a metadata model, to creating an authoritative controlled vocabulary, to even charting your workflow and establishing governance, metadata is critical to the business, and technology must make these goals achievable. And that being said, what are we talking about today? So we are hearing from Aldis today to talk about taxonomy design. When I was in grad school, one of my great cataloging professors used the following quote, which has always stuck out for me. And the quote is, "A place for everything and everything in its place." And that's what taxonomy is all about. A taxonomy classifies and organizes information, and metadata describes the information being classified. Think of taxonomy as the big buckets in which you organize things, and metadata as the essential bits and bobs in those buckets. Why do we organize things? Well, we organize because we want to find things, and we want to be efficient doing so. We know that taxonomies are ubiquitous, they're everywhere, but they're poorly understood. We know that content frequently organizes around hierarchies, making it somewhat easier to organize. But we also know that taxonomy has some benefits. We know that with the taxonomy, it will enhance and improve your search. We know that with the taxonomy, it will enable information discovery for your content. And we know with a good taxonomy, it'll save resources as content is being classified consistently. These are very good things to consider when we're listening to today's session. 2 more slides to go. It's important to remind ourselves that indeed taxonomy does have value. Taxonomy is not just strategic, which it is, but it has real business value to your organization. It ensures compliance with documented sources of knowledge, whether these things be standard operating procedures or manufacturing practices. We know that taxonomy creates that common language in a controlled vocabulary, and this will be able to be used across all departments and business units, and that is real value for an organization. And lastly, it brings processes into alignment. It reduces waste in time and the burdensome back and forth communications with customers and departments. Taxonomy is that important. Now, lastly, each week I want to do a little metadata minute where I give a brief overview of some key concepts around metadata. little bite-sized pieces for you to think about during the week. And today, what I want to share with you is that if metadata is data about data, then the taxonomy is the classification of that data. Metadata, as we know, is a strategic imperative in the endeavor to effectively manage and exploit all of your content. But metadata, like language itself, is a reflection of all of us. It is both subjective and objective at the same time, as it tries to define who we are, what we are doing, when we are, how we're doing it, and why. And more importantly, it changes over time as it evolves, matures, and is refined by our business, our culture, and more. If metadata is data about data, then taxonomy is the classification of that data. Take the time to not only organize and classify your data, but to govern your data well. And with that, I would like to hand over the presentation to Phil from Aldis. Over to you, Phil. There we go.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I had a minute there getting my screen shared. Hi, everyone.
It's all good.
My name is Phil Seibel. I'm here from Aldis Systems. We're going to talk taxonomy today. I'm joined by Autumn Shinka from Best Buy to supply a few real-world examples of the stuff we're going to be talking about. Just to let everybody know right off the bat, the slides are going to be available, and there is a handout available in the meeting chat there, so you can download that. Get the bulk of this information from the handout itself too. So if you just want to sit back and enjoy the presentation, feel free. So today we're going to talk about taxonomy design. One of the interesting things about taxonomy is that there are a lot of them that are out there that are created already that folks like to refer to, but you'll find when actually having to work with your content that you're going to want to design it yourself. You're always going to want to dive in there and make sure that the terms you use are represented and are classifying your assets in a way that makes sense to your users. So quickly, we'll look at what is a taxonomy. John already covered it really well, but basically it's a system of organization. It's usually represented by a hierarchical list of controlled terms. So that's where you're choosing how you're going to talk about your assets, how you're going to apply that information, and you're usually organizing it hierarchically. Not always, but usually. So let's talk about why you would need to build a taxonomy. Some of it's pretty straightforward. First off, well-organized and defined assets are easier to find and reuse. Organizing your assets and getting a structure built around them gives you a point of reference that can be used universally within your institution. Greater organization and greater ease of use of your existing assets is going to mean a better ROI on assets that you've already built and paid for and that you know are sitting there in your system somewhere and you just need to find them. Secondly, in the process of building a taxonomy, gathering feedback from your users is just going to make your DAM a better system. To build a good taxonomy, we'll talk about this more as we go, but you'll really want to engage your user base, whoever it is within the system that's going to be looking for assets or feeding assets into the system. You're going to want to engage your users and talk about all the folks who are going to be upstream and downstream from your DAM, and talking through this process with an eye towards building an inclusive metadata structure will help your team get a more holistic understanding of the steps that go into the creative process and the steps that go into making the DAM work on a day-to-day basis. And lastly, one of the best things you're going to get when you actually dig into building your taxonomy is making sure you get the right results, not just a lot of them. One thing you see a lot in folks who are trying to build an asset management system is they type in 1 or 2 words into a search and they get back thousands of results. Just a huge bucket of stuff that they then have to slowly filter through in order to winnow down to what exactly they want at the end of the day. And building a taxonomy and actually structuring your data and your assets will mean that you get a more accurate set of search results than you would otherwise. So instead of getting 400 records that you need to sift through to find something relevant, you may just get 14 assets that are much closer to what you're looking for to start with. So those are some of the whys of this. It can take a lot of work to build a taxonomy, and so understanding why you're doing it is, of course, a great jumping off point. So one of the big things that a taxonomy does for your system is it goes through this process of turning raw data into knowledge. And I feel like that's a big point with respect to taxonomy that often gets overlooked. We talk a lot about big data and we try and collect all this information and push it into our systems, but we don't often talk about how exactly it's going to be addressed by the users and how you're going to turn that raw information into something that is conceptually relevant to the people who are going to be using the system. That's starting to drift into the realm of ontology and ontological discourse with respect to what these words mean with respect to your assets. So I wanted to touch on that briefly by looking at some of the disambiguation that you can do when you're dealing with the taxonomy. So you're looking at, let's say, the term bat, right? It could be an animal, an Egyptian goddess, sporting equipment, and then are you talking about cricket or baseball? And that can just shift depending on if you're talking about zoology or biology, if you're in a historical or cultural artifact context, or sports. It's one word that has a whole bunch of potential meanings depending upon the context in which you're using it. Same for chair. Are you dealing with furniture in manufacturing, or is it an executive position? That's a big difference, and you're going to want to figure out how you're utilizing those terms and where you're placing them in the hierarchy of your DAM so that they actually make sense for what it is you're dealing with. Now I'll throw to Autumn for a sec here to maybe talk about a few real-world examples of how we try to do this while we were doing taxonomic building for Best Buy.
Awesome. Hi, all. Yeah, I'm Autumn Shinka. I'm an executive producer with Best Buy. I work on the internal video productions team called Yellow Tag Productions. So we do videos for Best Buy that appear in stores, on the screens in the stores, on bestbuy.com, social media, and also, of course, internal videos for our employees, so training videos, executive messaging videos, things like that. So we kind of cover the gamut of videos for Best Buy. And I've been with Best Buy in the Yellow Tag team for 19 years, and about, just to back up just a tiny bit, I was tasked with the all-important, how do we start to digitize and archive all of these tapes, right? Rooms of tapes of our video assets at Best Buy. Oh gosh, it feels like 5-6 years ago, I probably, it all kind of, the years at Best Buy for me, I think it blurred together for a while. But 5-6 years ago or so, how are we gonna do that? And gosh, we've learned so much through this journey, we really have. And so to answer your question, Phil, one of the things, that we learned was we originally kind of had this out-of-the-box media asset management MAM system. We call it our MAM, but of course, similar to DAM. We, with our MAM, we had this out-of-the-box system with a bunch of metadata fields. And so we had to figure out, okay, which ones applied to us and which ones didn't. And so we kind of created our own metadata fields that would apply to how we search for our footage for the videos we create for Best Buy. One of those metadata fields was location. So what we found was that when the producers would go to try to find, let's say, some footage. Oh yeah, there was some footage I shot in Orlando last year, and so location, they'd search for footage that they shot in Orlando. Well, up would pop up all these clips from an event that we had in Orlando. We also shot at some customers' homes in Orlando, and then also there was a bunch of footage from a store in Orlando. And so specifically, if a producer wanted just store footage, because that's where they remember shooting in the appliance section in Orlando, this rich, really rich appliance footage that they wanted to put in this new video, they didn't want to see all the footage from the event in Orlando. They didn't want to see all the home footage. They just wanted to see that appliance footage from that Best Buy store in Orlando. So what we had to do is we worked with Aldis, who we have as our vendor on contract, who manages our media asset management system, to say, how can we further classify, the location so that we don't get this huge, like Phil said, this huge search results. And so then we started to figure out, oh, we need to say Orlando, Florida store when we start to tag footage in stores. We have to say the city plus the word store. And so that's one way we were able to kind of differentiate. Another example that comes to mind, Phil, and you probably remember this, as we would start to, when I say we, I say producers, because that's the team. I manage a big team of producers, staff, and freelancers. We would start to go search for a lot of customer interaction shots. It's just a really popular visual that we use in a lot of our videos. But we created a metadata or a tag called customer interaction that we would apply to a lot of our footage. Well, then what we found was that if a producer was specifically looking for a customer interaction shot of a customer and a Geek Squad agent, for example, we would get all this footage and we're like, no, we just need a shot of a Geek Squad agent and a customer in a home, not all these other ones from stores. And so we had customer interaction, but then we had to go down and again specify with customer interaction home, customer interaction store, customer interaction blue shirt, which is what we call our salespeople in the store, customer interaction Geek Squad agent, and the list goes on and on. And most recently, we probably need to start adding customer interaction masks because we have to show masks. So Phil will get to that a little bit more as far as like how we continue to evolve and add, but hopefully that gives you a couple examples from the Best Buy world.
Yeah, exactly. The masks one is up and coming, isn't it? Thanks, Autumn.
Yeah.
So again, so that concept of taking the data you have and making sure that you can easily form it into knowledge for your users so that it works. And so moving into that theme more, how do you start doing this? Where do you start when you're making a taxonomy? And this is a huge hump that people have to get over. It's difficult to sit down and be like, all right, time to invent all the words that I'll wind up using for the duration of my job. So again, when you're trying to take this idea of creating knowledge for your users, figuring out how to give them the information that they need to get their job done from this big morass of data that you're working with, context is the key. That's how you figure out what it is that you're doing. You look at why you're doing these things. So you really need to understand your user journeys, and you need to figure out how folks are taking this raw information and giving it the context that they need to get their job done. Figure out what your internal workplace jargon is, use that knowledge to help your users. Don't sidestep the stuff that's really specific to your teams. Make sure it's included. So I find that two big questions that go a long way to creating this context is just sitting down and going, all right, who am I working with? Who are the people that are interacting with the dam? From the folks who are downloading assets at the end to the people who are uploading them at the beginning and everything in between. Who are the people that are dealing with this system? And of this group of people, what information am I working with? What information are they working with? What are they looking for? What are they using? What do they have on hand as they do this? So let's start out with who am I working with? Because always, always, always start with your users. They're the ones who are doing the work. They're the ones who need this information. They're the ones who need the assets. They're the ones that you want to make sure are happy and comfortable with your dam system so it's a success. And you're going to want to explore your users' information seeking behavior while you're doing this. And so that's more of a library world thing where you're saying, how do these people think about and talk about the assets that they need? Do they prefer to start with a big broad search and then whittle it down? Some people really like to do that so they can see if there's anything on the fringes they might want to utilize. Or do they really like to just do something super directed? They want to type in 2 words and find the thing they need and move on. Some people really like that sort of, berry picking scenario where they've got a big bunch of stuff, not too big, of course. You don't want them swimming in a sea of things, but at least having some selection. Some people really enjoy that when they're doing selects for something. They might want to find some variety in what they're doing. You build a system to do that, and you're going to have a very different experience than if you have somebody who's going to use a very complicated string of search terms to direct themselves to one thing. So very different approaches. You want to know who on your team is comfortable utilizing which approach. So again, when you're talking about that though, you want to figure out what's based on necessity in terms of that behavior and what is based on preference. So you want to look at the system with these people and say, are you doing this process of getting a big bunch of stuff and whittling it down because you have to, because you can never find this one thing that you need in a quick one, direct shot? Or are you doing it because it's actually how you prefer doing it? And that makes a big difference in people who are actually engaging the system. It really changes engagement. It changes the success level of what you're doing. And it really can be one of those things that sticks in your KPIs over and over again, saying, is this really doing what people want it to do? Because if people are using it a lot because they have to and they're not happy, you're not really making the dam do its job. So really sit down and figure out if people are happy with what they're doing. And engage all examples of your user journeys while you're exploring this. You've got producers, photographers, videographers, editors, graphic designers, executives, client users, so many other people who might be touching the system. Really take the time to dig into how they're doing their jobs. Really take the time to understand what they're trying to accomplish, why they're doing the things that they do, and how you can best serve their needs to make sure that they find what they want and it's coming to them, whether it's via, notifications that something needs review, or, if it's some way that they're saying, I got to make sure that this thing gets to X, Y, and Z people. Figure out if it can be a button push based on your taxonomy. Figure out if that taxonomy has workflow built in. For the terms that you're using beyond just descriptive work. So here, I'll throw to Autumn again for another real world example for how people are actually thinking about the media and the content that they're digging into, and how we adapted some of that while we were building stuff for Best Buy.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. When we first started using our system, the advanced search was super important, of course. And as we got more familiar with trying to find all this footage, I remember thinking, oh gosh, how come I haven't been using smart folders? Or another term is saved searches, we call them. Because I felt like I was doing sometimes kind of the same searches over and over every few weeks or every few months. And then I also discovered the fabulous world of clip lists, where you could save these clip lists. So let's pretend this is a true example. Like, we worked on a 50th anniversary video for Best Buy a few years ago. So we scoured, every bit of historical footage we could find and ingested from tapes and whatnot, and put it into the system. And then we created clip lists from there. Some of them were based on like CEOs, what year they were the CEO. So we would create like different eras, right? But these clip lists, I still go back to clip lists that I have created 3-4 years ago, because they are. I spent a ton of time searching for all that footage, put in a clip list, hand it over to an editor for, say, the history video. And now, essentially, I kind of don't have to do that again. In fact, these smart folders, Phil has been able to put tags on them to like auto-populate, so the smart folders just keep growing. Every time, we tag another piece of footage with the tag history, it'll continue to go into the history smart folder. So I just love that part of these systems, because you can kind of cheat. You don't have to start from square one. So there's very few times that I start from square one with the advanced search anymore. I go back to clip lists and smart folders to find footage, and it saves me a ton of time.
Great, yeah, thanks, Autumn. Yeah, so that's one of those examples of finding out how we work, how Autumn's team worked and how she worked, and making sure that we preserved that workflow and we made sure the metadata we gathered reflected the process that they really wanted to engage. And so moving on from the who and moving into dealing with that data, what data am I working with? That's that second question that I was pointing at. And this one can be super overwhelming. So I tend to start with 4 really basic questions here about, how do you start to get a grip on that? And it's, what information do I have? What information do I want? Where is that information that I want? And how do I get that information that I want? Because those are all very different processes. What's right smack in front of me? What do I already know? What is the stuff I'm missing? Where is it? It could be in another system. It could be on a call sheet. It could be in somebody else's head. And how do I get it? Do I have to talk to somebody else, get them to write something down? Do I need to build some sort of API compliant connection to another system? What do I do to get all those things together? So again, those are some really broad questions, but I find that they start the conversation and make sure you can roll into the process. So I'm gonna pull Autumn back again to talk about how we did this in a real world scenario here.
Yeah, it was a daunting task at first, because I mentioned we had rooms of tapes. And so we didn't have endless budget either to ingest everything. So we just kind of drew a line in the sand. I remember saying like, okay, what if we go back and ingest all the projects? In Yellow Tag, we do, at the time, we did about like 300 projects a year. So we were like, what if we go back the last 2 years and ingest, you know, the last 2 years of projects, all footage. But then beyond that, you know, we didn't, like I said, have endless budget to just keep ingesting. So we kind of went through with a fine tooth comb and went back the last 5 years and looked at just B-roll. What kind of like rich B-roll and visuals do we need? Then of course we had that history, 50th anniversary history video coming up. So we had to go back further that as far as like historical shots to ingest those. So we kind of, that's how we kind of went from like the tape to the digital. And then as I mentioned, like out of the box, there was like those fields, and so we had to figure out which fields, you know, are specific to how we would search at Best Buy. And then we had to start creating these pick lists. And then I remember thinking like, okay, but if these producers have all this footage, they go shoot next month and they have all this footage, now it needs to get into demand because that's the new process. How are we going to make sure that the metadata, appropriate metadata, is put into the system? Because Aldis didn't quite, it was so new, they didn't exactly know, you know, our how we were searching yet. It was brand new. Now they've gotten to know that really well over the last few years because they're just used to our footage. They know, oh, this is a Geek Mobile. Oh yeah, we know that this is Corey Berry, our CEO, so we tag her as such. So they get to know our brand, right? But initially coming in as a new customer. So we created the ingest sheet. And Phil, I don't know how many versions of the ingest sheet, right, that we have had. But
I think we're up to 7 at this point.
Yeah. Okay. I actually thought it'd be more than that. So actually, maybe that's not too bad. But it was literally a 1-page piece of paper that we created to simplify the process for our producers, who are sometimes, many of them are working on multiple projects at once. But we need to attach, like if we had to attach the most basic metadata to a project, just to get it into the system, to somehow find it, and I'm talking about like the initial ingestion. We have our producers later go in and add more metadata. So of course the tags are richer. But we wanted just a 1-pager that easily could be handed in with the footage when the ingestion process started. And so we had to kind of figure out like what those basic tags were. And I think that was really effective initially, and we still use that today. It's a digital form, of course, now that we hand in, but we still use that today because it's a great way to just initially get some basic tags on that footage and into the system as soon as possible. Because one of the things too that we found is we would hear, oh, there's another producer shooting a bunch of great Geek Squad B-roll. Oh, I need that right now too for a different project. And so we would, you know, we wanted that footage to get into our system as soon as possible so that other editors could grab it, because our editors are kind of, you know, all over the place. Of course, now they're really all over the place in homes, but we weren't all like in one location. We had freelance editors in a variety of places, and so they needed to be able to reach out and grab that footage as soon as it was available. And tagged, of course. You always got to be able to find it. You'll talk about that a lot, I'm sure.
Thanks, Autumn. Yeah, so I mean, that was how we initially addressed that idea of like, how do we get this stuff and where does it go? So once you've done that process of gathering all that information, now what? Right? What do you do with all of it once it's actually in hand? And this is where we're getting back to this concept of context is key for what we're dealing with. You've got all the information. Why is this information important to the users that you're dealing with? So that's this is where we start to get into the concept of crafting that context. And I like to take those same 4 questions that we just looked at and just switch out the what's for whys, basically. You know, so now reinterpreting it, why do I have the information? Why do I want the information? Why don't I already have this info that I was looking for? And why does this information belong in the DAM? And I feel like that last one's very important for building a taxonomy. And it's one of those ones that becomes the linchpin of your decision-making process. So a phrase you'll hear a lot when people are talking about DAMs is having a single source of truth. And I think it's a very important idea to make sure that your dam can be a single source of truth for all the information that is appropriate for the dam to hold. However, your dam doesn't have to be everything to everyone. It doesn't also have to be your PIM and every aspect of your workflow management. Some of that stuff belongs in other systems. It can be referred to by the dam to trigger certain things, but you don't have to house everything you've ever thought of with respect to your system and your information in the dam. And I think that saying, you know, why does this belong in the dam is a really important way of trying to delineate as you build your taxonomy between what is relevant and what is just kind of there. So it's a big question, and I feel like taking the what after you've done all the info gathering and changing it to a why is a great way to address this process of needing to build on your user's experience and your user's context after you've gathered all the data. So moving on from that, let's categorize all the answers we've gotten, right? Because taxonomy is about categorization. Now, I tend to try and think about this in terms of 3 basic functional buckets within your dam. This isn't a hard and fast rule, of course, and there's a big Venn diagram that blurs between all 3 of these, but I find in basic conversation with folks who are not librarians necessarily, and who are just trying to figure out how to organize their media and get their head around their process, trying to talk about technical data, administrative data, and descriptive data as 3 separate ideas really helps sometimes. Technical data being more like, you know, like up on the screen, file size, your location, your storage location, the pixel dimensions, the physicality of the digital thing is your technical data. Administrative metadata, looking more at, you know, producer name, job number, approval status, things that have more to do with workflow and the administration of the asset rather than the asset itself. Then you get to descriptive data where you're talking about the asset itself. You know, what's in this image, what's in this video, the names of the people who are there, really, you know, straight up describing it. That's what it's for. So that's really, those 3 buckets can kind of help once you've gathered the information with saying, okay, this is technical data. Who needs it, right? The IT team, if they're addressing anything, might need it to try and schedule an archive system or a backup system or a retention structure based on how much storage you have available. The IT team is really important to a dam conversation. Administrative data. Your producer really wants to know when that thing's going to air potentially. So you have to make sure that that gets stored in there somewhere, whether it's referenced from a system that has to do with review and approval workflow that actually pushes it to a content management system at the end of the day, or if it's something that gets triggered in the dam and the dam distributes it. Lots of different ways to slice that, but that's administrative data that's going to help you push your assets. Descriptive data. I need an image of so-and-so. You kind of pop a name in there and find them. Now, again, all these 3 concepts can bleed into each other. So you can see that administrative data, you know, and descriptive data, talking about, you know, what's the campaign, right? If it's a holiday campaign or something, that can be both administrative with respect to when you filmed it, when you pushed it, right down to, you know, descriptive data. It's a holiday piece, right? So you know exactly what it is there. So yeah, that's another sort of way of categorizing that I tend to drift towards when trying to build out a metadata structure. So once you've taken your information, you've sort of created these 3 buckets and you've gathered up what you want in terms of how you might classify these things, put something into practice. Actually start trying to put the information out there and see how your users respond, because after that, you really need to re-engage your users after you've tried to build something. You want to get feedback from engaged and thoughtful users who actually have a stake in your project's outcome. So I find there are a lot of ways to re-engage users. Surveys are awesome. They're great for gathering information on what your users want to see and what they want to do. Some good examples of surveys that have worked in the past for projects I've been on, you want to include terms that you want feedback on. So if you're trying to figure out how people talk about something, you know, are you saying car? Are you saying sedan? Like, how are you talking about these things? Add all the terms in there. Is it a 4-door or is it a sedan, or is it, you know, what do you want to call it? Put the terms in there, see what people say. If people are saying car, if they're saying sedan, you know, change your terms up. Make sure that you're actually reflecting the conversation that happens among your user base. Or you give them an example image or an example video and you say, you know what, give me 5 words that you would use to talk about this. And then see where the crossover is and the responses that you get. It takes some time, it takes some work, but you know, it really makes a difference in making sure that your system's effective. Have conversations one-on-one as much as possible with people. You'll find out some odd things like how people, you know, view the concept of time within your system. Do they work on the fiscal year? Do they work on the calendar year? How do people actually work on these? Do they talk about their video that they've shot based on the actual date they shot it, or do they look at their camera cards, your photographers or your videographers, and they say, you know what, I really need these to say day 1, day 2, day 3, because I know that that's how I'm thinking about when I actually captured images of various people. And it makes a difference when they're trying to get in there and find assets and reuse things. So figure out how people talk about it one-on-one as best you can. It can be difficult to find the time, but it's really worth it. Also, leverage the tech. Look for statistics in your system that support the need for a change of language or structure. Do you have any queries that you're constantly running over and over again that turn up 0 results? Do you have a way of tracking 0 result sets? Do you have a way of tracking if there was a query that used to get run all the time, still has awesome results, but nobody's asking for it anymore? Why is that? Why do people stop looking for that one type of asset? It's worth re-engaging it to see if maybe there's been a shift in brand or something that you haven't necessarily considered with respect to your taxonomy and the vocabulary that you're using. And then lastly, have patience with your users if they want things changed. A phrase that I use a lot is that often people don't know what they don't like until they see it. Sometimes you just have to build it, put it in front of them, and even if it's what they ask for, let them go, oh, that's terrible, I don't want that, and just be gentle with people. Have some grace and let them actually reiterate and reflect on what they're doing in terms of that feedback. So yeah, I'll throw to Autumn again for some real world examples of this, because I know this is one that we've, re-engaging users, something we do all the time. So Autumn.
Absolutely, yeah, Aldis has been such a great partner over the years. In it is a lot of conversations, and it's great because I think that's just our system just continues to get better and better. And one real life example I can think of is Phil's team reached out and said, we've started to notice there's a lot of footage coming in dealing with recycling, consumer electronics being recycled. And I was like, oh yeah, that's not a surprise that you're starting to see a bunch of that footage, because Best Buy has made some goals. This is a few years ago. We made some big goals around, it was like 100 billion pounds of consumer electronics recycled at our stores. And we were shooting for this goal in 5 years, and we hit it in like 3. And so because of that, we were promoting that a lot, and we were doing a lot of training videos around it, promotional videos and in-store videos and videos for social media and whatnot. And Aldis started noticing that. And so they reached out and said, would you like us to start tagging this footage recycling, or how would you like us to tag it when you're going to want to go back and look for it? Because initially that ingest sheet, if you talked about, might have been version 4, just had like in-store, like as tags, it would be like in-store footage. And then we would have maybe like televisions. Well, again, if I'm looking for recycled televisions for a future video and I go back to my archive system, I don't want televisions on the wall. I want the recycled TVs that are being brought into the store. And so I remember thinking like, oh, thank you so much for recognizing that a bunch of this recycling footage was coming into our systems, because yes, we most definitely want to make sure that that tag is applied to that footage. And then of course, it was my job to go and communicate with the producers and editors and whatnot to say, hey, this is a new tag. We have a new version of this ingest sheet. You'll notice here's the updates we made. And so if it's recycled footage, for sure to add that on. At Best Buy, things change so quickly, and they change a lot. And so, for example, I remember when Best Buy has gone through a couple of logo changes. Our Best Buy tag, or that logo, changed a couple years ago. Massive change, right? Our storefronts changed. Our shirts, the tag on our shirts changed. We also had a Geek Squad rebranding, so that whole logo changed, and all of our cars had new logos on them. Well, then, of course, the videos we made going forward, we wanted to make sure we were using the most updated logo and branding. So we had to kind of go back and start combing through some of that older footage with those older logos and removing them from the saved searches or the smart folders or some of those clip lists that I would often go back, kind of cheat and go back to and just pull, so I didn't have to start from square one from searches. And we kind of had to start rebuilding some of those things. And so it's a lot of work, because yeah, major branding change like that for sure creates a lot of work. But then again, it's important to go back and do that, because then of course you're not pulling a bunch of footage that you don't want to use. One other example I can think of is when our uniform has changed in the stores. our blue shirts, our salespeople used to wear khakis and blue shirts. Then we switched over to black pants and blue shirts. Then we got a new logo. So then we had new blue shirts with a new logo. Now they can wear jeans and blue shirts. So, and then the whole thing with Geek Squad too, different uniforms. And so again, that was another one we had to kind of go back and say, okay, what's the most current footage that when people are searching, we want that to pop up on the top. And so if I remember correctly, Phil, I think what we started to do is really make sure that the date, the auto population of these smart folders, we changed the date. Yep. So like, for example, for the customer interaction smart folder I talked about, we changed the date so that it would no longer pull footage of customer interactions with our Geek Squad agents or our blue shirts previous to the uniform change. And that's how we kind of got the old uniform footage out of that big saved search folder.
Yeah, absolutely. We had to figure out what the cutoff was for the branding and then adjust everything.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Autumn. Yeah, so that's a key example of re-engaging the users and saying, hey, you know what, we saw this and we want to make sure that we're actually doing what needs to be done to make this functional, make it work. And so, Autumn was saying it's a lot of work. It takes a lot to engage, and I think that that's something that doesn't get talked about in terms that try and address that need. So I wanted to also throw out there in this talk, why is this so hard, right? I mean, some of this seems like it's pretty basic. Talk to people, find the information, put it into play. And honestly, I get that. I get that some of it seems like you got to figure out some things that are just about talking to people and writing down terms. And sometimes it seems like it's becoming overly complicated. But I'll say, I think the biggest hurdle that comes from this process is that it requires you to make a lot of decisions and stick to them. You need to make the call about how you're going to talk about something, how you're going to structure your information, and somebody really needs to take the lead of the process at some point and saying, you know what, these are the calls we've made, this is the process we're running with, and then you're going to have to communicate it to everybody else and work on those reactions and work on that continuous communication. And that continuous communication is really a big part of it. You have to have a long-term plan. Governance isn't optional with your taxonomy. You have to be on top of it. You have to be paying attention to your users. You have to be paying attention to how people are interacting with the DAM. And these cycles of feedback and adjusting for what you're doing, they stick with the process, and you really need to make sure you're continuing with that. And it's hard to know where to start. That's what I tried to address earlier with saying, you know what, these are some good jumping off points, but it's tough to know where to start just right out the gate. So Autumn, do you want to, we had a little bit of that, but already, but you want to talk a little bit more about some long-term stuff we've rolled through and why it's been hard? I mean, I know there are some hurdles.
Yeah, I talked about a couple previously with the brand change, the logo change and whatnot. Yeah, I think one thing too with why Aldis has been such a great partner is they pay attention to the changes with Best Buy and our brand. They'll see things in the news, and so they'll reach out and say, hey, we noticed. In fact, I remember when one of our CEOs was fired due to an inappropriate relationship, we didn't want to use any footage anymore of him in our videos going forward. So we had to swap out a lot of shots and put a lot of that footage to bed. And in Yellow Tag, we're so busy, we're cruising along, we got enough going on with the new CEO change. But Aldis was a great partner because they said, hey, what would you like us to do with this footage? And so we were like, I don't know, oh my gosh, I don't know. But they were proactive in saying, okay, we're gonna go through the footage here and kind of put it to bed, put it to side so it doesn't come up on searches. So that was another example. I also remember I remember one specific example, but this is an ongoing thing too. So pick lists, basically like people, we would, create this big pick list. Well, that continues to grow. Those pick lists continue to grow as we shoot more footage and tag it with more people. But what I found one time was I was searching for a bunch of footage of Robert Stevens, who is the Geek Squad founder. And I was like, I know there's more footage in here that exists of Robert, and why am I not finding it? And I remember reaching out to Phil and his team. Well, come to find out in the pick list that someone had entered Robert Stevens spelled with a V and not Robert Stevens spelled with a P-H-E-N-S. And so when I didn't know that there was a bunch of footage that was tagged with the V. So one of the things that we realized early on is, oh, we really need to consistently check in on these pick lists and see if there's, we used to call it like dirty data, right? If there was dirty data in there that when searching, like I would never find it. Because I was specifically searching for, the correct spelling of his name. And so we would do like regular check-ins with these pick lists. And the Aldis team would send me, here's all the tags applied to this specific pick list. And I would literally go through and like cross out certain tags on these pick lists and be like, get rid of this one, doesn't apply, or Stevens should be spelled P-H-E-N-S, and then all of a sudden it would be much cleaner. It wouldn't be dirty data anymore. But yeah, that cleanup is for sure critical.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, every now and then that's the staying on top of it and having a long-term plan and making sure that governance gets done. Yeah, just making sure we're all checking in and and making sure that everybody's willing to go, oh yeah, that was a mistake, and just reset and make sure we got it running better as we go forward. So yeah, so again, it's going to take work, but it doesn't have to feel so hard as long as you've got plans and you're on top of it and you're doing regular check-ins. But yeah, and I want to end with just some tips that I had nowhere else to put in this presentation, but things that I felt like should be said anyway. So as just sort of an odd rule of thumb, unless there's a really compelling reason, I find that try not to go deeper in like 3 levels in a hierarchy just to make it easier to talk about. You're gonna, regardless of who you're talking to, they will start to glaze over if you're getting like 6 or 7 levels into a hierarchy. At that point, unless there's a really compelling reason to do it with everything else that you're working with, I find 3 levels tends to be kind of the limit for most people in conversation to be able to really conceptualize what's going on with respect to the hierarchy. And there's lots of ways to tackle that. And again, not a hard and fast rule, but I find that if you keep that in mind, your conversations will be a lot easier with your teams. As another point, I want to point out that we've been talking a lot about doing this by hand and doing it manually. And I want to say right out the gate, AI totally works for a lot of these things, but it does kind of wind up being like doing this taxonomic process in reverse, I find. You wind up with a lot of data that you need to cull or you need to try and weight the system coming back. And that process of saying, hey, this looks like it was 80% of the way with respect to this, the way this term was applied to our results and the relevancy of this term to this asset. That process of going through that selection based on the metadata that you get back from an AI, it's the same process you're doing when you're sitting down, you're building a taxonomy manually. Just rather than coming up with the terms and going internal with it with respect to your team, you're getting a big test bed of information that you're then trying to work on, both with your own process and with the team, pushing to them saying, hey, these are the terms we got in this big, influx that came back. And you have to do the same kind of quality control. AI is great. It's not perfect. You get a flyover of some trees, it might come back with broccoli. That just happens sometimes. And the systems are awesome and they're always learning, but you got to train them the same way you train people to engage your system, the same way you train people on your jargon. The AI needs to know it too. So I feel like it's kind of taxonomy in reverse, but it does work well if you're able to engage it and stay on top of it. And lastly, kind of a loose metaphor that I again like to use when you're trying to talk to people, find out if your taxonomy, if your software rather, is going to address the process of creating a taxonomy for your system, really as its backbone or as its lifeblood. And I like to use that analogy to be like, the backbone, that's rigid, it's necessary, it's structural, it's gonna stay there. You really don't want to touch it unless you have to. How concrete is that taxonomy going to be? If it's going to stick around forever, you know exactly what it's going to be like, it's going to be a major change to touch it, that's your backbone. If its lifeblood flows around, it's very essential, but it's fluid, it's flexible, you're going to really have to pay attention to it, and it's going to take a little more work, but it's going to really suffuse things a bit more. That's where you're really looking at a lot of descriptive data. That's where I feel like you're dealing with AI, a lot of information coming in, but there's also a lot of management on top of it, and it's getting through the whole system in a lot of different ways. So again, there's a lot of back and forth there. It's not a perfect metaphor. I like to use it just to talk about stuff and make the process a little easier when you're trying to have conversations with your users, because not all your users are librarians. Not all of them are going to know what you're talking about when you say taxonomy. They're going to want to talk about, vocabulary, terms they use, keywords. All that is baked into the process of building a good taxonomy for your system. But I find the more metaphor you can use and the more you can relate things in terms that make sense to folks who are doing their jobs, rather than go on, full academia with your taxonomy, the better of a time you're going to have with respect to trying to build it out and make it work for your system. So yeah, Autumn, any final thoughts? Any other tips you had that we didn't get to?
No, I don't think so.
Great. Well, with that, then I think we'll open up to questions. That's what I had.
Excellent presentation, Phil and Autumn. A lot of questions are being popped up already, but before we get to those, and just as a reminder to everyone, now is the time. If you were holding and saving those questions, go to the right side panel and start submitting your questions, and I'll be able to pick them up and then serve them back out to Phil and Autumn. Phil, you said something in there which is both courageous but just so honest, and I really, really appreciate it, having done this for many years, and for those on the call who also have been doing that. And you asked the question, why is it so hard? And it's true, and I think that's such an honest way to say it, because it is hard. And most things in life, some of those good things, they have to be hard to be that way. But it's hard for many reasons. So from my point of view, and I'd love to get your reaction to this, is because it's never done. Look at the examples that Autumn was showing. Look at the examples you were showing. It's never done because your products are going to change, your people are going to change, the way we describe things in our culture will change. So when executives are like, hey, is that taxonomy done yet? First of all, no. B, give more staff. And C, thank goodness for librarians. I mean, no, it's never done, and it never will be done. It's always in a state of evolution. So, how do you feel about that, Phil? About
I feel like, yeah, I agree. I feel like that's a very, it's never really done. I feel like taxonomy is this cycle. Taxonomy building is doing the dishes of the creative world, right? You're using them all the time. You need them if you're going to have this meal. But at the end of the day, somebody's gonna have to do the dishes. One might get dropped and broken, and you might need to go buy something new. You might microwave the wrong thing and it melts. But you've always got to be paying attention to it. You can't just leave the dishes. And I feel like that's what taxonomy building really is it's doing the dishes for your metadata work. You have to make sure the structure's there. You got to make sure it's well taken care of. It's got to be clean. Nobody's going to eat off a dirty plate. But that's how I tend to feel about it and look at it. And I feel like that's a good way to talk about it too. It's like, it's a task that has to get done. It's not glamorous all the time, but you got to engage it. You got to do it well.
No, and Autumn, you had such a great example of like some of the video footage you had, and you had even said, oh, we hadn't looked at this for a while. This speaks to governance and how we should look at not just our assets and our content, but some of the ways we describe certain things. Yeah, people change, footage changes. It's, you see a photo of someone, it's like, ooh, that's literally not you. That's from 3 years ago. Or even examples of that's not our logo. That was our old logo. Yikes. How did you not know that was not the new logo? Did you tell everybody? Did you communicate it outwards? So yeah, taxonomy, is it hard? Absolutely. Is it useful? Absolutely. Is it powerful? Yes, and it's so important, but it's never done. And it just always evolves and changes over time. Before we get to the questions, Phil, one more question to you. Where to start? I mean, there's a whole bunch of people in this call today. Where to start? Is it do you have a big cup of coffee, sit down in a chair, take a deep breath, center yourself? Where does one start to get this?
I think that the users is always the place to start. You figure out those user journeys, and then you find somebody who is, maybe it's the person having the problems, right? You sit there and you say, if you can't find your stuff all the time, how are we tackling this? Really talk to people. I find that that's really where you start. You find the people who are engaged with the system, who have a stake in it, right? Who really want this to work because they need to get their job done better, faster, more efficiently. They want to get that use out of stuff that they know they've shot, but they just can't find it. Or find the users. I also like to find the users who have already ginned up their own system. If you find the guy who has squirreled away 40 videos that they really love and everybody comes to that guy, go talk to him. He's already doing the work. Figure out what he's done and why the stuff that he or she has gathered is so good and everybody's coming to them. Find that person who's already doing half the work, because they're going to tell you a lot about what it is that people in your institution are already talking about. And if they have a system that is kind of kludgy and kind of working, you know, don't begrudge them that process, because they've really made it work. And it's a really valuable thing to find those people who are sort of self-starting the process and include them and make sure they're a big part of the process going forward.
Yeah, and those magical unicorns, or whatever you want to call them, they exist. We all have them in our organizations. After doing this for 20 years, I can tell you they do exist, and they're there somewhere. Go find them. She, he, they will definitely want to speak to you and tell you the goodness of it. So for those on the call today, go find those good people. They're out there. All right, Phil and Autumn, there are a whole bunch of questions. Some are short, some are long. Here we go. This one's a good one because it is a clarification question, and of course, I'm all about good definitions. This is from Tim Middleton. You had said earlier on in your presentation, Phil, you were mentioning clip lists, and I think Autumn might have referred to as a clip list. I think that's a good question. What is a clip list?
So it's basically a playlist. So it's a way of taking the assets that are already in the system and organizing them into a way. The way that it works in Best Buy system is you can take an asset and throw it into this list, and it doesn't duplicate the data, it doesn't duplicate the asset, it just creates a list that's a reference point back to the original asset. Autumn, anything else you want to add to how you use them?
Yeah, you know, I just sent a clip list to an editor literally a half hour before I got on this call. And what I did was I did a quick search for some footage I needed for this particular shot, which I thought, okay, yeah, I think these 6 shots, he could pick one of these and put it in there. And so I created a pick list, and it was called, you know, and then I named it. And then I took those 6 shots that I found through my search, put it in this clip list. It's like a little folder basically. And then I shared the link to that with my editor. And then the editor, when he clicked on the link, went to that clip list through our system and was able to download those 6 clips. And then he dropped the one in the edit that worked. So it's essentially just kind of like a folder that I created to drop some selected clips into. And like I mentioned, some of those clip lists that I've created for certain projects are like dozens of clips, because I spent like 2-3 hours scouring for every possible shot. So then, you know, it might be months down the road, I'll be like, oh, I already did that search and I sent that clip list to Ryan, my editor, for that other project. I'm just going to go grab that same clip list that's still sitting on our system, and I'm going to send him that link again, a different editor, but send that link again. So that it's kind of nice to have those, a bunch. We have a ton of clip lists created, and we do go and clean them out like occasionally, especially if they're super old, because we date them too. But yeah, they're a great tool in the system.
And I'm glad you pointed out the cleaning out too, because that it creates another hierarchy and another structure that we have to keep track of. One that has a ton of utility. We just got to stay on top of its relevance.
Awesome. Excellent new word added to the lexicon today. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so the next question, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Sagar. The question is, this is a sort of a deeper thinker, you know, sort of philosophical question. How could one think about maintaining the sanctity of the metadata structure with constantly changing business needs? We kind of referenced this already, but how does one maintain that? I mean, things change. We all change. Products change, business goals change, all those things. How does one do that, Phil?
I would say that one of the things you really need to do is, again, so I was saying towards the end that governance isn't optional about a taxonomic structure. And I think that picking out who it is that's going to be in your institution, that are the stakeholders that are engaged, and having individuals that you know are going to understand the context of the terms that are being used, understand how that system is going to roll over and need those changes. Have a group of people that will come to this project on a regular basis and schedule it, you know, be like, you know, this group is going to, the taxonomy group, the ontology group, however it is you're going to frame that, take those people, make sure that they're on, you know, a project that's going to be revisiting these things, and make sure that you have people in the room from the entire set of user journeys. Get IT involved. Get people in there who are going to have a stake in talking about this, and make sure everybody's heard, but make sure that you have representative people who are really engaged, as opposed to necessarily making it a fully, scattershot thing. It's great to get the feedback. It's great to get all that information, but you have to distill it into a few decision points and then put that in front of a group of people that really understand the context of the users as a whole. So I think that from a standpoint of how you do that functionally, it's you figure out a governance team for your vocabulary and for your taxonomy. You make sure everybody's represented. You make sure that they're getting a list of decisions to make.
Phil, you make me so happy. I'm a big believer in governance. Governance is not an option. From what I've seen over the years of doing this, systems with governance work well. Systems without governance do not work as well. I wonder why. Governance, for those of you on the call today, think about it, read it, remind yourselves of it. If you can do it, start it on literally tomorrow. It's a good thing. It really does help. This one isn't really a question, but it's a statement, and I wanted to share this one because I thought it was quite great. Phil, you were talking earlier about you had functional types, and this individual said, and this is from Patricia Peterson, she says, I'd consider copyright and licensing as a fourth functional type, and I say I applaud that, and I think well done, Patricia, on that. So that's more of a statement, but I agree with that. Copyright.
No, I like that. I tend to like umbrella it under administrative, but absolutely, like, that's where I go with that.
Right.
Excellent point though, because it's a huge piece of any given asset management system. Whatever you're dealing with, you got to know you can actually use the stuff.
What you can do, and more importantly, what you can't do with some of these assets, because we all know from
lawyers,
the objects, oh, that looks great, I'll use it. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you can't actually. Stop, drop, roll, all those good things. You had a few good shout outs from Reem saying this was an excellent session. Here's a good question, and this one comes up a lot, and this could be an entire half-hour discussion on a separate issue, but this is from Emil, what is your view and use cases that you've seen for multilingual metadata? So not just English, but what about French, German, Spanish, Italian, Canadian, Parisian French, Quebecois, Castilian Spanish? There are some use cases for that. What have you been seeing?
Autumn, do you want to speak to any of that, given that Best Buy has a lot of, okay, I'll jump on it.
I was going to say I was just going to say that the languages we use are mainly closed captioning or subtitling. So we're a North American brand. We just have stores in Canada, United States, Puerto Rico. So we have French, Canadian, and Spanish, but we just use subtitling. So
yeah. But at least we understand, with respect to the system, which ones have which languages and which ones have which captioning, or if they have all the captions baked into a single multi-track master. But I think that it depends on, you have to address the linguistic needs of the various audiences that you're dealing with. And a lot of it boils down to, if you have teams that are working within the DAM that are multilingual and they need to talk about what their work is in a fashion that's multilingual, or if you have end users who are multilingual, where you're delivering multilingual packages, that's a very different scenario. You need to figure out which one that is, and then figure out, depending on your software, you may have to have multiple sets of metadata where you're trying to duplicate architecture and terminology based on who your primary user base is in any given region. You may simply need to figure out how you share assets and differentiate the data, not by virtue of content, but by virtue of wrapper, the language. You need to figure out how to communicate with your teams and your users in the most effective way. And if that most effective way is their native language, you should really try your best to accommodate that.
Always, and as you said earlier on, Phil, go back to the users. Who are your users? Where are your users? What are they looking for? Are they in Quebec, which is different than the rest of Canada? Are they in a certain part of the United States where potentially there could be a different population group? Always be mindful of those things, let alone issues of potato chip versus crisp, little things like that, biscuit versus cookie.
Context.
It's all context, absolutely. Great shout out here. Anne says, metadata is the laundry of assets. It's never done. I love that. The laundry, you're going to use that one. That's a good one. Great question from Alexandra. Can you talk about how multiple taxonomies might work together in a system? I'm thinking of the example you shared of the refinements to location working in concert with the taxonomy for a topic or type of footage. So multiple taxonomies, they do exist. It's not an anomaly. They do exist a lot. So how do they all work together?
Well, Autumn, I'll speak to this a little bit, and then I'll throw to you on this if you don't mind. So within the system for Best Buy, there are multiple groups that we've carved out depending on who's actually addressing the system. A lot of the metadata is shared, and a lot of the metadata is applied to these given to any given asset en masse, right? You take the entire taxonomy, you make sure that the asset has access to it, but you change the presentation layer that you give to your user so that they're only seeing information that's relevant to them. So you're utilizing a much larger taxonomic structure, but you're really refining it for how it gets put in front of your user base. So Autumn, I think we've done that any number of ways with Yellow Tag and other units inside of Best Buy.
Yeah, because we also have like a marketing team and a live events team, and then like I mentioned, we're mainly internal communications, but we also create videos for external. And those different teams within Best Buy, I mean, we're a company of like 5,500 corporate employees and 100,000 plus people in our stores in the field. But the main users of it, of course, are at corporate, but there's like these three main teams that you mentioned, and they use the system differently. So you mentioned like rights management earlier, John, and so I'm thinking of like our team at Best Buy that does our TV commercials, because of that footage is it's got so much rights management associated with it. They don't typically go back and grab, shots from a different TV commercial shoot to put in another one. They just start over at the next TV commercial, right? So a little different than our team but I really liked Phil's example of like you mentioned like the three layers as being the deepest we would go. I think that's so critical because, yeah, otherwise it's like I was thinking about how that customer interaction example again, and then the next layer down being our Geek Squad agent, and then maybe the next layer down being in a home. We wouldn't necessarily go be like, oh yeah, now we need the next layer down in the kitchen. Like that's, you don't really typically have to go that far down. So I like the 3-layer aspects because I'm trying to think of other examples too, where 3 seems to be like the sweet spot where we would, yeah.
I used to think it was 5, but I think that's just because I like data.
We love data.
Yeah, I think getting a large taxonomy where exposure is key is kind of how you develop a taxonomy that can work in parallel for different groups.
Yeah. So I don't know if I answered that question.
Yeah, I hope we answered the question. Sorry.
The good thing about the feedback is there are so many more questions to get through. We will not be able to get them to the next 7 minutes, but there can be some follow-up afterwards, Phil and Autumn. So individuals who may not have had their things answered or a little bit more clarification, that can happen after the next 7 minutes. Autumn, a question for you from Jorge. Autumn, from a metadata tagging perspective, how much was discovered from production notes in physical assets versus when ingested? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, initially we had like tapes, that we were ingesting into our system, and we did have a FileMaker Pro system that had basic metadata in it. So that was good that we were able to refer to that other old archaic system to now put it into our new system, the DAM. So we did have that. Production notes, I will say, like, yeah, producers will come in off a shoot to create that MAM ingest sheet. And they'll also have, like the clapboard will have the director on it and the date and the name of the project and the project number. So that's, helpful as well. But that MAM ingest sheet was like, it's kind of like the key to the initial metadata. And then, as I mentioned, we really encourage all of our producers on a regular basis to go in and add even more footage or more metadata and tags from a particular shoot or production, so that information can be even richer, if that makes sense.
And I think one of the things that's really nice about where Best Buy's system has gotten to is that the producers really think about that aspect of reuse and really think about that process of tagging now as, I do want to, they come to the system going, I do want to find this later. I know how my coworkers think about it. So this process of engaging people has really changed the mindset of the way the production cycle goes over time.
It influences everyone within, anyone who's touching assets, they're being influenced by these decisions as they go along.
Yeah.
So this next question is what I would call it's in the weeds, but I think it's good that it's in the weeds because I think it's going to make us all think differently. And the question, it comes from Catherine. When you realized that you needed to be more specific with tags, did you use another tag or create a more specific tag? For example, customer interaction geek, or was it customer interaction and geek?
Ooh, yeah, that's an excellent question.
It is a great, yeah.
So I think it kind of depends on the fields you've already created to describe your assets, right? So if you've got sort of personas out there that you've already built out, and you've got a way to associate a persona with a given interaction type, then you might have customer interaction, and then you apply the personas appropriately. If you don't have that and you don't want to create more fields, that's dependent on talking to your team. That's talking to Autumn, that's talking to the other folks at Best Buy and saying, look, do you guys want to have a longer term here that makes more sense? Or do you want to disassociate these terms so we've got more granularity and we can create relationships between the terms, but you're going to have to think in terms of more fields. And that's where you get into that conversation about information seeking behavior with your users. Do you want to look at one field, have it be a little bit of a jargony block and just deal with that? Do you like that? Is it nice to have it front and center? Or do you want to be able to do a cherry pick from a couple of different places to coordinate into something that's more targeted? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I was going to say, I remember that specifically with the location in the store, having this conversation. And actually we chose to kind of duplicate efforts, meaning that we had I can't remember the exact metadata, but it was like store interior or store exterior, but we also added the word store after Orlando, Florida. We put store, and then there's also an Orlando, Florida location, to pick from as well. But we decided to just make that longer. But then it was kind of duplicated because there was another field then that talked about store exterior, store interior. So even if somebody did choose like Orlando, Florida, if they chose store and one of the other, or store interior and one of the other metadatas, they would still get the Orlando, Florida store footage, if that makes sense.
It does.
So it's kind of a fail-safe.
Yeah, different people were thinking about it in different ways. So we created a way to make sure that the layers would overlap and match regardless of how somebody was approaching the terms. And it hasn't caused confusion or anything, and people are able to get their work done and find what they need. So.
And this goes right back to the question of why is taxonomy so hard? Because you need to always be reevaluating and talking to your users and ensuring that the words are optimized to what they're looking for at a certain point in time. That's why it's so hard, but it's so good at the same time. We've got about 2.5 minutes left. Let's see if we can do 2 or 3 more questions. This comes from Hillary. Phil, how do you, Phil and Autumn actually, how do you consolidate different user needs in your DAM? You mentioned users' needs, and users are so important, but yes, you might have 5 different user needs for looking at things in your DAM. So how do you consolidate that? How do you make everyone happy?
You can't make everyone happy. And that's part of it too, is just saying, you know what, hey, we're gonna keep working towards an ideal, and you accommodate the user needs kind of as they roll in. You figure out what data can be applied in multiple ways to whatever somebody's trying to accomplish, whether it's the approval process, whether it's the ingest process, whether it's producers trying to find B-roll or something at the end of the day. You figure out what data applies to everybody, and you try and make something as general as possible, as lean as possible for everybody to hit. And then you figure out if there are ways to adjust and customize and make sure that every given role has some capacity for looking at the system through a lens that makes sense to them. And the way to do that really is, when you're dealing with teams, the whole thing is that these people, there's a through line to this, right? There's a team working to create something at the end of the day. And whether it's the project that makes sense or the campaign that makes sense to everybody, that through line exists. And you have to make sure that reference point is established for everybody in the project. And then you use that way of conceptualizing the day-to-day work or the product that's getting created at the end of the day, whether it be a commercial or any other finished piece of media, and you make sure that everybody has those consistent reference points. You find the common vocabulary and you hone in on that, make it lean, put it front and center, and then try and address individual needs.
We do not, it just turned to the 15-minute part of the hour. There are a lot more questions for the two of you going beyond this. So first of all and foremost, thank you audience for participating in this and generating these questions. Phil and Autumn, they will be there for you to refer to afterwards. I would like to shout out to you, Phil and Autumn, for such an excellent presentation. A lot of great comments here. This is affirming. That's exactly, I'm on the right track. A lot of shout outs for the two of you for such a great presentation. I want to mirror that as well. This was taxonomy design. It is hard, but it's so good and it's so valuable, and that's why we need to do it. So I want to shout out to both of you and say thank you very much for participating in the Metadata Roadshow number 2. Before we go, everyone, remember we are back next week to do another session for the Metadata Roadshow. I want to give a quick shout out to Mike last week who helped do the Q&A, and Phil and Autumn, again, the questions are here. There's a lot more here, a lot of positive, good questions for the two of you. I want to thank everyone for participating. We'll see you all next week, and keep on thinking of your taxonomy and keep on thinking of your users, because it's not done and it's only going to get better with time. So Phil, Autumn, thank you so much on behalf of Henry Stewart, and for everyone on the call today, have a great day. Be well, be safe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Autumn. Thank you, John.
Sure,
Thank you.
bye.